G'day, Michael from ironbarkgamesstudio, and welcome to the 12th part of this tutorial series, which is an introduction to keyframe animation in Blender. So games will often have dozens of animations depending on the type of game and what actions are required of a character in a game. An easy one to start off with, which is basically used in every single game, is an idle cycle. So when a character is standing still, they're not going to be completely still, they're going to be moving ever so slightly. Jumping into Blender, we have our character all rigged and bound from the last couple of tutorials. Now we want to animate the rig. So keyframe animation is the process of adding a keyframe to an object, moving the timeline forward or backward, then transforming the object and creating a new key. The program will then interpolate between the two keyframes, animating any changes in the position, scale, or rotation of the object. So we're going to come up to the top animation tab here. And on the left we have our preview without anything sort of in the way of our character, and on the right we have our regular layout with the rig visible and ready to go. Down the bottom we have a dope sheet editor. I'm going to drop down the dope sheet and I'm going to select the action editor. The dope sheet displays keyframes for the entire scene, whilst the action editor is specific to an object. In this case it's the rig. With the rig selected, I'm going to click on the new button here, and that's going to create a new action, and I'm going to call this idle 1. To save this animation, I need to click on the fake user button. So if I have a whole range of animations, they're not all going to be assigned to the rig at any one time. So clicking on this button, just make sure that they're saved when the action isn't assigned to the rig itself. And then one final thing to set up, right down the bottom of the action editor, we have this keying button here. I'm going to pop that up, and under the active keying set, I'm going to set that to location and rotation. So now whenever I press the hotkey to add a keyframe, which is I, it's always going to rotate the location and rotation, and it's not going to ask me every single time. So I can quickly press I, and that'll add in a keyframe. So I'm going to go into pose mode now, so Control Tab. And I'm going to manipulate these controllers so my character has a fairly relaxed pose. So I'm going to grab the waist and move it down so that the knees are slightly bent. We could move the feet apart just a little bit as well. Grab the hand and we want to rotate it. You can also go into side view. Control 3 to go to the other side view. And I want to curl the character's fingers. So, I'm going to grab all of the finger controllers, hit R, double tap X, rotate it something like that, maybe rotate the thumb in a little bit as well. And if I want to copy the rotation and position of one side to the other, I can select the controllers I just moved and hit Control C, and then I can press Shift Control V. And that's going to copy the pose on the other side. So Control C to copy the pose of the currently selected bones or controllers, and then Shift Control V to paste that onto the other side. Now with the timeline on frame 1, I'm going to press A to select all of my bones and controllers, and I'm going to press I, and that is going to keyframe them on frame 1. Then going to move my timeline to around frame 70. I'm going to select the keyframe here. So this top keyframe will select all the ones below it. If I just select one of these, it selects that, but also highlights the top one. So select the top one, press Shift D to duplicate that keyframe, and then paste that on frame 70. So the reason why we're doing that is we need the first keyframe and the last keyframe to be exactly the same, and that's going to create a seamlessly looping animation. And over 70 frames, this animation is going to be about 3 seconds long, so 24 frames per second, about 3 seconds. Then in the timeline, I'm going to set the end frame to frame 69. The reason why I'm not setting it as 70, which is the end frame here, is because we don't want the last and first frames to overlap, because that will create one frame where both actions are exactly the same position, which can cause a slight stop in the animation. Now that we have a beginning and end frame keyed in, we need some movement in the middle. So I'm going to go to the 35 frame mark, so right in the middle of our animation. And I'm going to make some adjustments to the rig, the character. So I'm going to grab the hips and just move them up slightly. And I'm going to grab the spine, and I'm going to rotate this back on the Y slightly. I'm going to select both controllers and press I to create a keyframe. So now, if we scrub through, the character is slightly moving up and the chest is rotating back. If we want to play our animation, we can just tap space on the keyboard and space to pause it, and that should seamlessly loop through. For a little bit more movement, I'm going to go to frame 30. I'm going to grab the spine.01 controller. I'm going to rotate this back slightly as well. Hit I to create a keyframe there. Going to grab both of these shoulder controllers, and we're going to grab them up a little bit. I to keyframe. And we're going to get a bit of a sort of breathing effect, I suppose. And then frame 35, going to grab these fingers and I'm going to clench them just slightly. So R, double tap X, curl them just a bit. Control C, Shift Control V, copy them on the other side. Make sure we have all of the finger controllers selected, and then press I to create a keyframe. We'll go with something like that. And then maybe at the frame 50 mark, we'll grab the neck and we'll sort of counter rotate that forwards so that when the character's leaning back, the head will still stay sort of relatively straight and looking forward. Probably a little bit too much there, so if we ever make a mistake, we can either just delete the keyframe with X and then delete keyframes, and we can just come in here again and we'll make this a fair bit more subtle. And there we go. We've got a very, very simple idle cycle animation. Let's take this a little bit further and create another idle cycle. So in games, typically characters are going to have more than one idle cycle. They'll have one basic one which gets played a lot, and then they might have a special idle cycle that gets played every now and again. So let's create a more unique idle cycle animation. I'm just going to put my timeline back on 1. And next to this idle, I'm going to click on the new action button, and that is actually going to copy the idle animation here. I'm going to rename this to idle_2. I'm also going to make sure I click on the fake user button so that it saves. So if I open this tab up here, we can see we've got two animations here. Both of them have a little F in front of them, which means they are both saved. If I press A to select all of the bones, we can see that it's also copied all of the keyframes as well. Now I only want to keep the starting keyframes here, so I'm going to select all of the other ones, hit X, and delete those keyframes. And this animation is going to be a bit longer, so I'm going to set the end frame to 140. I'm going to grab the keyframes here, I'm going to go to frame 141, press Shift D, and duplicate them all the way to the end, so we have our starting and ending keyframes are identical. I'm then going to press A to select all of the keyframes inside of the action editor. Then I'm going to press T and set the interpolation, which is by default on Bezier, to constant. And what constant interpolation is going to do is it's going to prevent the smooth transition from one keyframe to another. So instead, the animation is going to jump to the next pose when it is reached. So this is really useful when blocking out more complex animations where you have specific poses at particular timelines. So what I'm going to do for my character is I'm going to have them fold their arms, look to the side, and then unfold their arms and go back to their starting position. So on frame 20, I'm going to create a crossed arms pose. Alright, let's go with something like that. I'm going to key all of the controllers that I just moved, so I'm just going to select them all. And then press I. And now if I scrub between the keyframes, instead of interpolating between them, I'm just jumping to the key poses. So I'm going to want to copy these keyframes here at frame 20. I'm going to jump to frame 120. So with these keyframes selected, I'm just going to go Shift D, duplicate them to frame 120. Then I'm going to jump to frame 70. I'm going to key the controllers up the body to the top of the head, press I. Then on frame 85, I'm going to rotate the controls so the character is looking to the side. So let's rotate these like that, but mainly rotate the neck so the head's pointing in this direction. And then we'll just keyframe all of these. I. Going to duplicate these frames that we just created to frame 95. So the character holds this pose for 10 frames. So the idea here is start at frame 1, frame 20, the arms will be crossed. Frame 85, the character will be turned. They'll stay turned for 10 frames. And then by frame 140, they'll be back to the starting position. So I'm going to press A to select all frames, press T, and go back to my Bezier interpolation. And we can play this through. It's going to look pretty messy. And one thing I should do is these frames on frame 70, I'm just going to duplicate them to frame 110 so that it turns back a little bit quicker. Alright, something like that. And now it's going to be a process of cleanup. So there's a fair bit of clipping and a bit of unnatural movement between the key poses now. So for example, with the hands, as we scrub through here, we can see that there's clipping between the hands and the chest, and we sort of want to bring everything out a little bit more. So around halfway through the pose, we're going to add in some new keyframes. So between 0 and 20, it's about on frame 10. I might just grab these hands outwards so that they're not going to clip through the chest when they fold over. Press I to create a keyframe. And also the pole targets as well. I just move these out a little bit so the elbows aren't too far in. It's looking better. And we're going to need these between 120 and 140 as well. 130, let's bring these out. And the other hand as well. We'll make sure the hands aren't clipping through each other, so let's bring the left side out a little bit more. And we might even make them come down a bit quicker as well. And maybe around frame 15, I'll bring out the left hand a little bit more. And we can even offset the left hand so it arrives a little bit later than the right hand, sorry. So we can just grab these keyframes and just move them forward a little bit. Probably a little bit too much. So it just arrives a little bit later. Alright, just rotate that right hand so it sort of settles into position as the left hand does. Just check the end frames to see how they sort of come apart. I reckon I want to rotate this one out sort of fairly early on. And it might even start its motion a little bit before the left hand. And I reckon we should uncurl the fingers a little bit sooner as well. So if we just grab those 4 fingers there, I'm going to copy the end keyframes here so that they unfurl a little bit quicker. Going to go to about frame 5, and I might just sort of move the shoulders up just a little bit and then sort of move them down once the arms are sort of rested. So we'll actually start at about frame 22, just go I to keyframe the shoulders, and then 5, press I to keyframe the shoulders there. And then in the middle, around frame 14, just going to move them up a little bit and just rotate them back on the Z just a little. Might want to grab them up just a little bit more. Not super happy with that, so I'll just delete the keyframes, and I might just grab them upwards. I think that looks better. So for the head turn, I'm just going to select all the bones involved in that. And what I want to do here is I kind of want to offset them a little bit. So currently all of the bones along the spine are moving at the exact same time. I want them to move in slight steps from each other. So we want the head to rotate first. So this is the head here and here. So this is where it starts, that's where it stops rotating. I'm going to grab both, and I'm just going to move them a couple of frames to the left. I'm going to grab the next one up, move that couple of frames to the left. To the left again. And there. So we get this effect where the head moves first, and then the rest of the body sort of rotates with it afterwards. And we want the same effect on the other side, so we probably want the head to start rotating back, and then the rest of the body will follow. So we'll just offset everything by a frame or two again. And I might even do it so that the head starts rotating first, but it gets back last. So let's sort of do the opposite sort of rotation. So pull those keyframes to the right. So the head sort of starts rotating back, but it's a little bit slower than the rest of the body, and it gets there a little bit later, so it's sort of lingering in the direction that it's looking. So we kind of want something to happen in between frame 1 and sort of 60 to 70 when the character starts rotating. So it's very static during that point there. So what we might do is we might just have a little bit of movement in the body. So we'll grab the hips and just grab them up ever so slightly, just so we've got a little bit of motion in the body between these frames. We might even want a bit in here as well, just a very small amount of motion. And let's just have these shoulders rise up ever so slightly here as well, perhaps. Print keyframe 60, maybe around 40. Gonna hold shift to go in smaller increments. Alright. And one more thing we can do in this period is with the fingers on the right hand, we might do a little tapping motion. Let's go to frame 40. Let's go to frame 35, and we'll grab these 4 finger controllers. Press I, and then on frame 45, we press I, and then in between here, we're going to rotate these on the X up like that, and hit I. And we're going to offset these so the fingers tap in sequence. So let's have the pinky start first. So we'll grab these frames and just shift them across to the left. Grab the next frames down, shift them across to the left. And then these ones. So we get a little finger tap in there. And let's just watch it all the way through. And there we go, that is our second idle cycle. So of course we could add a little bit more cleanup. Not quite happy the way the shoulders are sort of acting at sometimes. They seem to be rotating a little bit too much, I think. So I might want to clean those up. But for now, I think that is a pretty good point to stop. So that's just a couple of simple idle animation loops to get you started and into the basics of animation in Blender. And don't forget how important motion is, even if a character is standing still. In the next tutorial, we will cover creating a walk cycle for our character, which will involve a greater focus on creating key poses. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you found it useful. You can check out our Patreon link in the description with a variety of rewards such as starting files, tutorial notes, and early access to the rest of the series. And I'll see you in the next one.